My name is J. Warner Wallace, and I've been working in Los Angeles County as a police officer for about 25 years and as a cold case detective for about a dozen. And for a long time, I was not a believer. I was actually somebody who was not raised in a Christian environment, so my background was pretty skeptical. My father was a police officer before me. My son is now a police officer after me. And so my perspective was I didn't really trust things that were told to me unless I could vet them out evidentially. And most of the Christians I knew were not people who could make a case for what they believed. I had friends who were officers, and these officers would explain to me why I should be a Christian. But if I asked them, can you give me good reasons why I should trust what the scripture says anyway? They were, for the most part, unable to help me. And as a matter of fact, the same people who could make a case for why a particular suspect should be arrested were unable to make the case for why I should trust this writing called the Bible. So I, for the most part, was not interested. And as time progressed, I learned that I could actually test the Gospels in a particular way using the skill set I had as a cold case detective to determine if these things were reliable. And that's exactly what I did. This has resulted in a book I wrote called Cold Case Christianity. And for the most part, that was my journey from skepticism and atheism to Christian theism. It was really on the basis of the reliability of those texts, the reliability of those documents. Now, in the years that followed, I started to speak locally at churches and ultimately at conferences and larger settings. And I found myself just really wanting to ask the question to my audiences, why are you guys Christians? That was really important to get an answer. Why are you folks Christians? And I was struck with an answer that really, in several categories, that I thought was really interesting, and it was very common. As a matter of fact, I could predict in advance for the local pastor what his congregation was going to say in terms of these answers. Why are you a Christian? The largest group of answers, the largest category, were answers that were akin to, well, I was raised as a Christian. I've always been a Christian. My parents were Christians. This is all I've ever known. Good answer, but it was interesting to me. That was the most common answer I would get in these settings. The second kind of answer I would get was an answer based on experience. I've had some experience that I felt demonstrated for me that Christianity was true, or God moved in some way and made himself known to me, and as a result of this experience, I believe that Christianity is true. Another good answer. The third category was a category kind of similar to the second. I've had an experience. I was a bad person. I was kind of a jerk before I became a Christian, and I met Jesus, and I'm not so much a jerk anymore. This transformation of one's personal life was in the third category of the kinds of responses I would get. And the fourth category of responses I would get was rather theological, an idea that I'm a Christian because God's Spirit moved in me and confirmed for me this is true. I'm a Christian because God made it so. God called me to this. All good answers. But what struck me about these answers is that I had an experience as an atheist growing up in an atheistic family. My dad, his second wife, was an LDS believer, a Mormon. And he had 6 kids with his second wife. All of them became LDS Mormon believers, Latter-day Saints. And I recognized that if I was to ask my Mormon family and friends, why are you a Mormon? They would give me the exact same answers I was getting at these talks I was doing when I would ask Christians, why are you a Christian? It turns out that the Mormon answer sounded exactly the same. And so if I was to have a conversation, and if I was to offer one of the same kinds of answers that my Christian friends would offer, we'd be stuck at a stalemate. I've had an experience that demonstrates for me that Christianity is true. Well, I've had an experience that demonstrates for me that Mormonism is true. Well, God's Spirit confirmed Christianity for me. Well, God's Spirit confirmed Mormonism for me. We were stuck. We were stuck at a stalemate because in reality, there was no way to differentiate between these two kinds of answers. I recognized immediately that we need to have better answers. And I knew as I was examining Christianity and Mormonism side by side as an atheist, I recognized that I'd have to be able to figure out which of these two systems is true, given that they say opposite things about many key points. So that's where I found myself, trying to figure out how to differentiate between these systems. And could you do it on the basis of experience alone? I didn't think you could. Now, at the same time, I was starting to work with young people. And the young people I was working with as a youth pastor, I eventually became a Christian. I went to seminary. I started working as a pastor in the local church. And my young people, I noticed that the very first generation of kids that I had, the first year, my graduates, my seniors, by the Christmas break of their freshman year in college, they were no longer Christians. And I thought, I am like the worst youth pastor in the history of youth pastors. And then I realized I wasn't alone. The national statistics for young people who will leave the church in the years between their high school years and their college years is staggering. It's disappointing. And some research actually suggests that what really happens is that young people check out much earlier than that. They check out while they're in junior high and high school. They just don't want their parents to know. And by the time they're out from under the wing of their parents in college, they are already gone. I thought, well, how do I address this issue? When I asked my own students, what was the reason? What changed you? It was because they were in a hostile environment in university and had become convinced by their university instructors that Christianity was not true. I knew I had to change what I was doing. That first year as a youth pastor, I was very experiential. It was mostly music and environment, and it was experience every Sunday. And it wasn't sufficient to hold my students in place through the most challenging years they were going to face in university. I needed to change my approach. And I recognized something very, very essential to all of this. You can be an accidental Christian. In other words, you can believe that something is true without really having any evidential reason for knowing that it's true. I could happen to be in the right place without knowing why it's the right place. I can be saved and trust my salvation, trust Jesus for everything, yet not know what the evidence is that would suggest why Christianity is evidentially true. And what I notice with young people is if they hold that kind of faith, an accidental faith that's not grounded in good reasoning, well, someone's going to try to reason them out of that. And often that happens. And that's something we have to consider. If you want to have a faith that is grounded, you will stand in a time of challenge, you have to have a faith that you know is true. More than just experience, because you're going to encounter somebody out there who has had an experience themselves and wants to convince you that their experience is every bit as valid as yours. The other thing I noticed is that when you compare experience to evidence, there's an important distinction. Experience can often lead you to truth. It can. Unfortunately, though, experience can also lead you to error, as it has for a lot of my family who are Mormons. They've had an experience, they are convinced by their experience, but they are not in the truth because they've only been convinced by their experience. Evidence has the ability to lead you to truth, but also protect you from error. And that's the advantage of taking an approach to your faith, which is evidential. Now look, we have to make a decision as a church, as a culture, that this is important for us, that this is our duty, this is what we are called to do and who we are called to be. And so let me just do a little thought experiment with you, just to kind of make the point clearer. If I told you that God visited me yesterday in a dream, in a vision, and gave me 3 important things to tell you, you might rightly say, I'm not quite sure that's true. How do I know that God gave you 3 things to tell me? Well, I would say, look, I've had an experience. It's a vision. This vision was as real for me as any vision I've ever experienced. You need to trust me. This really happened. This really was my vision. I don't know, Jim. I'm not quite sure I could trust you for this. Okay, that's one way of making the case. What if I told it to you this way? What if I said, God came to me yesterday in the form of a human and gave me 3 things to tell you. And he had lunch with me in my backyard with 3 of my friends. Not only that, he looked over my dry grass in Southern California and he said, I can help you build an irrigation ditch for this. And we laid pipe in the irrigation ditch in my backyard. Then he looked at my tree and he said, I can help you with a tree house for your kids. And he built this amazing tree house all in a couple of hours. It was incredible. Now, that kind of claim, the second kind of claim, is very different than the first kind of claim. The first kind of claim is based on a private vision. You could never test. You could never verify it or falsify it. You're just kind of stuck with it. But the second kind of claim, that's actually something you could test because it's grounded in an activity, in an event that took place yesterday in my backyard. You could talk to my friends. You could examine that irrigation ditch. You could look at that tree and see how cool that tree house is. In other words, you could actually attempt to falsify it or verify it. I mention this because the claims of Christianity are in the second category, not the first. We have a claim that's grounded on an event that happened in history called the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's very different than other theistic claims, like Buddhistic claims, for example. You can test our kind of claim because it's grounded in history. And that's what we ought to be doing. We ought to be seeing this examination of evidence as an act of worship. Here's what I mean by that. It's not unusual for us to see worship as simply the songs we sing on church on Sunday, or it's the prayers we offer God, or it's our effort to serve in our local community, or to do a short-term or a long-term missions trip. But there's another way to worship God that is commanded in Scripture. We're to worship God with all of our heart, our soul, all of our mind. So the question becomes, well, how is it we can worship God with our mind? The time you're taking right now to consider the things of God is, in fact, an act of worship, because you could be spending this time doing any number of other things. And that would also be a form of worship toward those other things. Instead, when we focus on why Christianity is true, we now are worshiping God with our mind. And that's what we do when we develop a forensic faith.